Currency prices can be volatile, and organisations with exposures to foreign currencies can be significantly impacted by unfavourable movements. This is especially the case for importers and exporters who have frequent transaction exposures on their buying and selling activities. It is also highly relevant for organisations with foreign operations or dealings who may have translation exposures for their assets and liabilities. Organisations can have competitive exposures, which refers to having competitors who source their goods or services in a different currency. An Australian importer will typically buy goods quoted in a foreign currency. It will need to sell Australian dollars to buy the foreign currency, to then pay for the goods. When the Australian dollar falls or devalues, then it is more expensive for the Australian importer to import goods priced in the higher currency. For example, assume the cost of an imported good is $1,000. If the exchange rate is 80 US cents, then it costs 1,250 Australian dollars to buy. If the Australian dollar falls to 75 US cents, this increases the purchase price to 1,333 Australian dollars. This highlights the transaction exposure for the importer. In addition, a falling AUD can stimulate local production by making Australian producers more competitive in price against those foreign imports. The Australian importer may have competitors that source goods from these cheaper domestic sources, providing it with competitive exposure. An Australian exporter may sell goods quoted in a foreign currency. Upon receipt of the foreign currency, it will need to sell the foreign currency and buy Australian dollars. When the Australian dollar rises or appreciates, then the Australian exporter receives less Australian dollars from the foreign currency conversion. For example, assume the sale of an exported good is $2,000. If the exchange rate is 80 US cents, then the exporter receives 2,500 Australian dollars. If the AUD rises to 85 US cents, this reduces the amount received to 2,353 Australian dollars. This highlights the transaction exposure for the exporter. Note that if the exporter sells the goods in Australian dollars, a rising AUD will mean that it costs more for the foreign purchaser to buy the same amount of goods. While the exporter may not have transaction exposure in this situation, keep in mind that the foreign purchaser may look to buy the goods from another source, highlighting the potential for competitive exposure. Consider the situation where an Australian organisation, where the AUD as its functional currency, has a borrowing denominated in a foreign currency. It needs to service the ongoing interest payments and repay the loan at maturity, and the Australian dollar value of these payments will be affected by foreign exchange movements. In addition, during the term of the loan, the organisation reflects the value of the loan as a liability on its balance sheet. This value will fluctuate with movements in the foreign exchange rate. If the foreign borrowing is $1 million and the exchange rate is 80 US cents, the organisation has a liability of 1.25 million Australian dollars. However, if the Australian dollar weakens to 75 US cents, the value of this liability increases to 1.33 million Australian dollars. This highlights the impact of the organisation's translation exposure, that is, converting the value of a foreign currency denominated asset or liability back to the functional currency. Identifying foreign exchange exposures is an extremely important component of an organisation's financial risk management framework. These exposures can take the form of transaction exposure, translation exposure, and competitive exposure.